In a war defined by mud, barbed wire, and machine guns, one army decided its soldiers needed to be dressed in the brightest colors possible. This wasn't a tactical masterstroke. It was a fashion choice that sent thousands of men to their deaths. This is the story of France's dumbest uniform. At the outbreak of World War I in 1914, when Europe was about to plunge into one of the bloodiest conflicts in history, the French army marched onto the battlefield dressed as though it were still the 19th century. Instead of practical uniforms that blended with the earth, the forests, or the gray smoke of industrial war, French infantry soldiers wore dark blue coats paired with bright red trousers. These red trousers weren't just a little colorful, they were glaringly obvious. In the dull browns and greens of the Western Front, they stood out like painted targets. The French soldiers, known as poilus, looked like they had stepped out of a Napoleonic painting and straight into the age of machine guns. This uniform choice wasn't about military strategy, it was about tradition. France's high command still clung to the belief that the bayonet charge, that heroic rush across open ground, was the ultimate display of courage and would shatter enemy lines. To them, the bright red trousers symbolized bravery, nationalism, and a connection to the glory days of Napoleon. The argument was simple. French soldiers did not need to hide because they fought with honor, not deception. This idea might have made sense in the wars of the 1800s, when soldiers stood in lines and fought at close range. But in 1914, with artillery shells, rapid-firing rifles, and machine guns cutting down men by the thousands, it was suicidal. Imagine for a moment what this looked like on the battlefield. A French infantryman in his red trousers is ordered to charge across an open field toward German positions. The Germans, dressed in gray field uniforms that blended into the landscape, lay hidden behind trenches and barbed wire. They had already set up machine guns capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. The French soldiers, lit up by their bright colors, like walking bullseyes, ran straight into a storm of bullets. Entire lines of men were mowed down before they even came close to the German defenses. The red trousers that were meant to show courage became a death sentence. The French weren't blind to the problem. As early as 1912, military reformers had pointed out that the red trousers were a disaster waiting to happen. Some officers had argued for duller, earth-toned uniforms, like the British khaki or the German field gray. These uniforms were practical, harder to spot from a distance, and far more suited to modern war. But French politicians and generals resisted. The Minister of War at the time, Eugène Etienne, famously declared, "Le pantalon rouge, c'est la France." The red trousers, they are France. To him, and to many in the French high command, changing the uniform meant abandoning national pride. This stubbornness was not just symbolic, it reflected how unprepared France was for modern warfare. The French military establishment had built its doctrine around the idea of offensive outranciac to the limit. They believed that sheer willpower, courage, and relentless assault would always overcome the enemy. The red trousers fit neatly into this philosophy. They were not meant to protect soldiers. They were meant to remind the men the world of France's fighting spirit. But war, in 1914, was no longer about spirit alone. It was about firepower, artillery barrages, and defensive positions that could shred entire battalions. When the war began, the results were immediate and catastrophic. In the opening battles of August 1914, such as the Battle of the Frontiers, French soldiers were sent charging across open ground in their bright uniforms. The Germans, dug into defensive positions, fired with devastating accuracy. The red trousers made the Frenchmen far too easy to target. Casualties were staggering. By the end of the first month, France had already lost hundreds of thousands of men, killed, wounded, or captured. The bright uniforms had played their part in turning these battles into bloodbaths. What makes the story even more striking is how slow the French leadership was to adapt. Even as casualty reports flooded in, there was resistance to changing the uniforms. The generals clung to the belief that tradition and honor mattered more than camouflage. They dismissed complaints from the front lines and doubled down on their insistence that red trousers symbolized national identity. But soldiers in the field knew better. They could see with their own eyes how their uniforms turned them into easy prey. Many accounts from French infantrymen describe the sheer terror of charging across fields where their comrades fell in heaps, their red trousers visible from hundreds of meters away. Other countries were watching closely. The Germans, in their gray uniforms, blended almost invisibly into the mist and smoke of battle. The British had adopted khaki decades earlier, learning their lesson from colonial wars. The French, by contrast, clung to fashion and pride, and the cost was thousands upon thousands of dead. Wasn't until late 1915 that the French army finally replaced the red trousers with the more practical horizon blue uniform. By then, the damage had been done. An entire generation of Frenchmen had been sacrificed in part because of a uniform choice that belonged to another century. To really understand the absurdity of this, imagine modern soldiers today being sent into battle wearing neon colors as if their job were to stand out rather than survive. That's what the French army did in 1914. It wasn't just dumb, it was catastrophic, and it reveals a deeper truth about how armies often resist change, clinging to tradition even when new realities demand adaptation. This was not just a mistake of cloth and color, it was a mistake of mindset. The French military had convinced itself that morale, spirit, and national pride could overcome bullets, shells, and machine guns. The red trousers were the most visible symbol of this outdated belief, and the men who wore them paid the ultimate price. This story is just the beginning of one of the strangest and deadliest fashion choices in history. A choice that turned battlefields into slaughterhouses and proved that pride can be more dangerous than the enemy's bullets. If you want to hear how this disaster unfolded and how the French eventually learned from their mistake, make sure you like this video. Leave a comment and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more unbelievable stories from history's darkest chapters. The French army's uniforms were more than just outdated. They were a fatal flaw in a new kind of war. World War I was not a war of parades or glorious bayonet charges across open fields. It was a war of trenches, mud, wire, artillery, and machine guns. It was a war where visibility meant death and concealment meant survival. Yet French soldiers marched into this nightmare dressed like painted targets. Their blue coats and bright red trousers shone against the dull backdrop of the European countryside. In an age where weapons could kill men from hundreds of yards away, their uniforms might as well have been bullseyes stitched into fabric. The German army, by contrast, had already learned the value of blending into the battlefield. Their field gray uniforms, introduced years before, allowed soldiers to disappear into smoke, mud, and shadow. When French troops advanced, German soldiers could crouch low in their trenches, barely visible until they opened fire. For the French, there was no such advantage. The flash of red gave them away instantly. Snipers could spot them with ease, and machine gunners had no trouble lining up entire groups of men as they crossed open ground. The French High Command had expected a fast-paced war. They imagined that their soldiers, driven by courage and the power of the offensive spirit, would sweep across enemy lines in dramatic charges. Instead, they found themselves pinned down by relentless machine gun fire and heavy artillery. Their vibrant uniforms, meant to inspire pride, left them hopelessly exposed. In battle after battle, the fields were littered with the bodies of men cut down before they ever reached the enemy. At the Battle of the Frontiers in August 1914, this fatal flaw became clear. French forces surged forward in their traditional uniforms, determined to carry out their doctrine of attack at all costs. They charged across open terrain, only to be met by German riflemen and machine gunners, who needed little effort to find their targets. Casualties mounted at a shocking rate. Thousands of men fell in minutes, their red trousers standing out starkly against the green fields and brown earth. These battles were not victories of courage, but massacres made easier by poor preparation and outdated thinking. The uniforms were not the only sign of how badly the French had misunderstood the war they were fighting. The generals clung to tactics of movement and shock, believing that willpower could overcome firepower. But World War I was not a war where men could simply run faster or shout louder to break through defenses. It was a war of attrition, where trenches stretched for miles, and each inch of land was bought with rivers of blood. The French had prepared for a war of speed, but found themselves trapped in a war of grinding endurance. In the trenches, the impracticality of the uniforms became even more obvious. Red trousers and blue coats stood out against the mud and dirt of the dugouts. Soldiers huddling in shallow cover were painfully aware that they could be seen by any enemy watching through binoculars. A single careless movement, a leg stretched out in the wrong place, could catch the eye of a sniper. And in this war, snipers were patient and deadly, waiting for the smallest slip to send a bullet through a soldier's chest or head. The uniform did not protect the minute, betrayed them. It is easy now to look back and see how foolish the decision was, but at the time, tradition weighed heavily on the minds of French leaders. The red trousers symbolized France itself. They were tied to a national identity that refused to yield to practicality. To strip them away, many argued, was to strip away the spirit of the army. This stubbornness cost the French dearly. By the end of 1914, French casualties were already reaching into the hundreds of thousands. Men were dying not just because of the enemy's firepower, but because their own leaders had sent them into battle dressed for a past century. Consider the psychological effect on the men themselves. For the average French soldier, stepping onto the battlefield in red trousers meant knowing you could be seen from a mile away. Every step forward carried the weight of inevitability. German guns did not need to search for you, you carried your own mark of death. Many soldiers wrote in letters home about the horror of seeing their comrades collapse around them, their uniforms painted brighter still by blood. They knew that bravery alone would not shield them from a hail of bullets, yet they had no choice but to obey. The new war revealed something else too, the clash between old ideals and modern reality. The French generals believed in honor, in valor, in courage shown by men advancing openly against the enemy. They saw camouflage as dishonorable, as though blending into the battlefield was a kind of trickery. But the Germans did not share this view. They understood that survival depended on adapting to the weapons of the time. A machine gun had no respect for courage. It tore through bodies without hesitation. A sniper's bullet did not pause to consider the honor of its target. The battlefield rewarded adaptation, not tradition. This mismatch of ideals and reality had devastating consequences. At battles like Charleroi and Mons, the French advanced again and again, their uniforms marking them out in the chaos. The Germans, using cover, concealment, and modern weapons, inflicted staggering losses. French officers, often mounted on horseback, and just as brightly dressed as their men, were picked off quickly. Units lost their leadership in the opening minutes of battle, leaving chaos and confusion. By the end of 1914, it was clear that the red trousers were not a symbol of pride, but a liability that had cost France dearly. Even as the war dragged on, resistance to change remained. Politicians and traditionalists in Paris fought against altering the uniform. They argued that France's identity was tied to those bright colors. They believed that dull, practical clothing, like khaki or gray, would sap the army's spirit. But soldiers at the front knew the truth. They begged for uniforms that would let them blend into the mud and smoke, uniforms that might give them a chance at survival. Only after horrific losses and mounting pressure did the French army finally begin to replace the red trousers with the horizon blue uniforms in 1915. By then, the damage was irreversible. The fatal flaw of the French uniform was not just in its color, it was in the mindset behind it, the refusal to accept that war had changed. Machine guns, trenches, artillery, and barbed wire demanded new tactics and new thinking. Instead, the French clung to symbols of the past, and those symbols, stitched into every pair of trousers and every coat, led thousands of men to their graves. The story of those uniforms is not simply about fashion. It is about how stubbornness, pride, and tradition can blind even great nations to the realities of war. It is about how an army that should have learned from the wars of others walked blindly into a slaughter of its own making. And it is about how, in the age of industrial war, the brightest colors were not a mark of honor, but a death sentence. The French army's reliance on bright uniforms was not simply a fashion mistake. It was a catastrophic failure of leadership. At the heart of the disaster lay generals and politicians who were still trapped in the incenting of the 19th century while sending men to fight in the reality of the 20th. The high command clung to a belief that sheer bravery, the moral spirit of the offensive, would be enough to carry their soldiers through. They believed that tradition itself could win battles, that the sight of soldiers advancing boldly in red and blue would terrify the enemy and inspire courage in their own ranks. What they ignored was the fact that this was no longer a war where gallantry could shield men from bullets. The reality of modern warfare was brutally clear by 1914. Machine guns spat out hundreds of rounds per minute. Artillery shells fell from miles away, tearing entire units to pieces before they even saw the enemy. Snipers lay hidden, patient and cold, ready to kill the first hint of movement on the battlefield. This was not the kind of war where colorful uniforms and the idea of honor could make a difference. Yet the French generalsmen like Joseph Joffre, who commanded with stubborn confidence, continued to insist on tactics and appearances rooted in the Napoleonic past. The cost was measured in blood, not victories. At the Battle of the Frontiers, the flaw in leadership became undeniable. French troops marched into the fields of Belgium wearing uniforms that practically announced their arrival. When the order came to advance, they did so bravely, shouting battle cries and raising bayonets. But bravery could not stop a hail of bullets. German machine guns, hidden in well-prepared positions, cut through their ranks with horrifying efficiency. From the German perspective, it was like target practice. From the French perspective, it was slaughter. Leadership had told them that their courage would carry the day. But courage was meaningless when your commanders had turned you into a walking target. The most shocking part was not that soldiers died in these uniforms. Every soldier in war faces that risk, but that their leaders had every opportunity to see the danger and ignored it. Other nations had already abandoned bright colors. The Germans had their field gray. The British had their khaki. These armies understood that blending in was no longer cowardice, but survival. And yet the French leadership treated calls for change as almost unpatriotic. Politicians declared that red trousers are France. They refused to acknowledge that in the age of modern weapons, those same trousers were killing France's sons by the thousands. Leadership's stubbornness reveals how arrogance and pride can be as deadly as any weapon. The generals were not ignorant men. They had decades of experience in military affairs. But experience can also blind. They had fought in colonial wars where European armies faced enemies with inferior weapons. They had marched in parades where uniforms dazzled and inspired. They had grown up in a world where symbolism carried as much weight as strategy. So when the Great War began, they fell back on what they knew, even when the evidence showed that the world had changed. Letters and diaries from French soldiers paint a devastating picture of how this leadership failure was felt at the ground level. Men wrote about the horror of stepping onto the battlefield and realizing they had no chance of remaining hidden. They spoke of advancing in straight lines, only to watch entire rows of comrades collapse around them within seconds. They saw their officers, just as brightly dressed, fall in the opening minutes of combat. Without leadership on the field, units broke apart in confusion. Soldiers understood what their generals would not, that their uniforms were not symbols of pride, but death sentences sewn in red cloth. The idea that bravery alone could win battles was not just naive. It was insulting to the men forced to fight under those conditions. Bravery is valuable, yes, but bravery without strategy, without adaptation, is nothing but a waste of human lives. The French soldier had courage in abundance. He proved it again and again, charging into fire, holding the line in trenches, enduring unimaginable losses. But his courage was squandered by leaders who refused to adapt. A soldier cannot hide his bravery behind cover when his trousers glow like a signal flag. He cannot fight effectively if his officers cling to doctrines of the past, while the enemy uses the weapons of the future. The catastrophic leadership failure also highlights how wars are not only fought with guns, but with ideas. The German generals had embraced the reality of modern combat, prioritizing camouflage, field entrenchment, and combined arms tactics. The French generals embraced an outdated philosophy of élan, the belief that moral spirit could overwhelm bullets and shells. That philosophy may have worked in the age of muskets and cavalry charges, but in the mud of World War I, it only fed men into the machine guns. When an army clings to old ideas in the face of new realities, disaster is inevitable. It is worth imagining what might have been different had leadership acted sooner. If, before the war, they had listened to reformers and modernized the uniforms, thousands of lives might have been spared in those first months. If they had abandoned the blind faith in the bayonet charge and adjusted their tactics, the slaughter at battles like Charleroi and Feroza Shah might have been lessened. But instead of adapting, leadership doubled down. They sent wave after wave of men into the fire, believing that the next charge, the next show of courage, would finally break the enemy. Each time, the only thing that broke was the army itself. The deeper tragedy is that the French soldier did not fail his country. He fought with determination, discipline, and loyalty. What failed was the leadership that guided him. A soldier can only do so much when his commanders treat him as a symbol rather than a human being. When generals care more about the appearance of uniforms than the survival of their men, the war is already lost in spirit. That was the lesson France learned in blood during the first months of World War I. This failure of leadership should not be dismissed as a simple mistake of color choice. It was a broader failure to see the war for what it was. The generals were trapped by their own arrogance, their own traditions, and their own blindness to change. They thought they were leading men into battle as in the days of Napoleon. In reality, they were sending men into the meat grinder of industrial war, with no protection, no camouflage, and no chance. It was leadership, not a vision, but of vanity, and it cost France a generation. The French army's pride carried a price, and that price was measured in blood. In the first months of the war, more than 300,000 French soldiers were killed. These were not just numbers on a page, but fathers, sons, and brothers who marched onto the battlefield expecting a war of glory and returned only as names on casualty lists. The tragedy of their loss was not only the scale, but the speed. In less than half a year, France had bled a generation, and the dream of a quick victory evaporated into the mud of the Western Front. The French entered the war convinced that their courage and offensive spirit would overwhelm the enemy. Politicians and generals promised that Germany would be beaten back swiftly, that the tricolor would fly over Alsace and Lorraine again, and that the war would be won by Christmas. But pride clouded judgment. Pride told the generals that their soldiers' willingness to advance in bright uniforms would shock the Germans into retreat. Pride told them that Elan, that almost mystical fighting spirit, could triumph over steel and lead. The truth arrived in the form of machine gun fire. Pride did not stop bullets. It only filled more graves. The battles of August and September 1914 revealed the cost of this thinking in horrifying detail. At Charleroi, French soldiers advanced into open fields, their uniforms visible from far off. German gunners, hidden and entrenched, opened fire. Entire battalions were shredded in minutes. At Morhange in Lorraine, French forces pressed forward with the same offensive doctrine. Again, artillery and machine guns cut them down. Men fell so quickly that survivors described fields carpeted with bodies. Uniforms turned from red to black with blood and mud. The generals had promised swift victory, but what the soldiers received instead was slaughter on a scale they could not comprehend. Imagine being a young French soldier in 1914. You had grown up hearing stories of Napoleon's glory, of cavalry charges and heroic bayonet fights. You were told that your courage would carry you through. You marched in red trousers and a blue coat, proud to represent France. But then you stepped into a battlefield where the enemy was invisible, hidden behind earthworks and barbed wire. Suddenly, the air was filled with the roar of artillery and the relentless rattle of machine guns. Your friends fell beside you, not from sword or lance, but from weapons that killed at distances you could not even see. The pride of the nation had dressed you for a parade, but it had not prepared you for industrial slaughter. In those opening months, the losses shocked not just France, but the world. Over 300,000 French dead meant tens of thousands of families grieving all at once. Towns and villages across the country saw their young men vanish. Mothers who had proudly sent their sons to war received telegrams telling them those sons would never come home. The French countryside became dotted with fresh graves. For a nation that had entered the war with confidence, the reality was devastating, and yet the French High Command refused to admit fault. They blamed the terrain, the enemy's numbers, even fate itself. What they did not admit was that their pride had led to disaster. They had refused to change uniforms, refused to adopt more cautious tactics, refused to see that modern war required new thinking. Instead, they clung to the idea that sacrifice itself would eventually lead to victory. The problem was that sacrifice was limitless when pride refused to bend. This pride was not limited to uniforms or tactics. It shaped every part of French strategy. The plan, known as Plan 17, called for bold offensives into German territory. It was not built on careful calculation of the enemy's strength, but on the assumption that the French soldier's spirit would always prevail. But when that spirit collided with German machine guns, the result was predictable. The French army suffered staggering casualties without achieving decisive gains. Pride had not only blinded their leaders to reality, but had condemned their soldiers to fight battles they could never win. The humiliation was not just military, but psychological. France had expected to be the hammer, driving into German lines with unstoppable force. Instead, it became the anvil, absorbing blow after blow while its armies retreated and regrouped. The early defeats left scars on the national psyche. Soldiers began to question the wisdom of their commanders. Civilians, who had been told the war would be quick, realized they faced years of bloodshed. The war that was supposed to restore French honor now threatened to break France entirely. Still, the French soldier endured. Despite the losses, despite the humiliation, they continued to fight. They dug trenches, held the line, and faced horrors their commanders had not imagined. This resilience should not be mistaken for acceptance of leadership's pride. Rather, it was a testament to the grit of ordinary men. They bore the cost of decisions made far above them, decisions rooted in arrogance and vanity. Their sacrifice was the only thing that kept France in the war after those disastrous early months. The scale of casualties is almost impossible to grasp today. More than 300,000 dead in just a few months meant that every battle was a national trauma. In some regiments, half the men were lost in a single day. In villages across France, entire age groups of young men vanished. Classrooms, farms, and workshops were emptied. The war's opening was not just a military campaign, but a mass tragedy that reshaped French society. The high price of pride can also be seen in how slowly change came. Even as the casualty numbers mounted, leaders hesitated to abandon old traditions. The shift away from the red trousers and bright coats took time, and even then, it was done reluctantly. Pride made every adjustment a struggle. What should have been obvious that camouflage was necessary, that caution was not cowardice, was resisted until the losses could no longer be ignored. The French army that went to war in 1914 believed it was prepared for glory. Instead, it found itself locked in a brutal, grinding conflict unlike anything Europe had seen before. The pride that had once seemed a source of strength turned into a curse. It blinded leaders, doomed soldiers, and plunged France into a war that was longer, bloodier, and more humiliating than anyone had predicted. Pride had promised a quick victory. What it delivered was hundreds of thousands of dead before the war had even begun in earnest. The lesson was clear to anyone who dared to look. Pride had not protected France. It had cost France, cost it lives, cost it victories, cost it dignity. The soldiers paid that price in full, with their blood staining the fields of Belgium and France, while their leaders clung to illusions of honor and tradition. For the French army, the first months of the war were not a march to glory, but a descent into tragedy, all because pride refused to step aside for reality. The brightly colored uniforms of the French army have become one of the most enduring symbols of a strategic failure in modern warfare. In history books, paintings, and even classroom discussions, the image of French soldiers marching to war in red trousers and blue coats has been pointed out again and again as an example of military pride colliding with technological reality. The soldiers themselves did not design these uniforms. They did not argue for bright colors or cling to Napoleonic traditions. That decision came from the very top, from generals and politicians who wanted the army to embody courage, honor, and visibility on the battlefield. But in the new age of machine guns, barbed wire, and rapid-fire artillery, the result was not glory, it was slaughter. The French refusal to adapt quickly enough to modern war cost them dearly. In 1914 alone, more than 300,000 men were killed. Their uniforms made them visible targets, easy to track through scopes and rifle sights. The Germans, dressed in muted gray, blended into the landscape. A French soldier, however, could be picked out from hundreds of yards away. The contrast could not have been starker. One side embraced camouflage, while the other clung to tradition. That tradition became humiliation. The legacy of the red trousers was not just the staggering casualty lists of the early months. It was the way those uniforms became a reminder of arrogance. The French high command, so certain of its doctrine, had dismissed warnings from reformers who had argued for a change in appearance and tactics before the war began. In the years leading up to 1914, some French officers had suggested moving to less visible clothing. They had pointed to other armies, like the British and Germans, who had adopted khaki or gray. But French leaders rejected these calls, arguing that dull colors would sap morale, that soldiers in gray or khaki would look like they lacked pride. They believed that the spirit of the French army needed to be embodied in its colors. It was not only a matter of uniform, it was a matter of national identity. Yet once the war began, this choice became impossible to defend. Reports came back from the front describing mass casualties of soldiers cut down in droves as they advanced in bright lines across open ground. Survivors described the horror of charging across fields while machine guns rattled relentlessly, and they knew the color of their uniforms made them easier targets. Many soldiers began to despise the very trousers that symbolized national pride. They did not see them as honorable anymore. They saw them as a death sentence. This humiliation forced change, but slowly, by late 1914 and into 1915, reforms began to take shape. The bright uniforms were gradually replaced with horizon blue, a lighter and more muted fabric, designed to blend with the battlefield. It was not perfect camouflage, but it was a drastic shift from the garish red. The French military had finally accepted that modern war could not be fought with the symbols of the past. Yet the delay in reaching that conclusion meant that countless lives were lost unnecessarily. The reforms were not celebrated, but came as a reluctant admission of failure. The story of these uniforms also carried a wider lesson for military leaders around the world. Pride and tradition could not be allowed to dominate strategy in the age of industrialized warfare. Technology had changed the rules. Machine guns, barbed wire, and heavy artillery did not care about symbols or morale built on appearance. A soldier's survival depended on cover, concealment, and adaptation. France's early refusal to recognize this truth became a global warning. Other nations saw the disaster unfold and drew their own lessons. The French army's humiliation reshaped thinking across Europe. At the same time, the humiliation was deeply personal for France itself. The men who fought and died in those uniforms were not faceless statistics. They were individuals who believed they were serving their country honorably. The shame of the red trousers was not their shame, it belonged to the leaders who had failed to protect them. The ordinary French soldier bore the consequences of decisions made in offices far away from the front lines. This sense of betrayal added to the bitterness that many veterans carried long after the war ended. In villages and towns across France, memorials were erected after the war. Families gathered around stone monuments inscribed with the names of those who had died. Many of those names belonged to young men who had marched off in the bright uniforms of 1914. When survivors spoke about their first battles, they remembered how the colors made them stand out. They remembered how quickly their ranks were thinned, and they remembered how it felt to be sacrificed to a tradition that had no place in modern war. The red trousers are often cited today as one of the clearest examples of military stubbornness in the face of change. They are remembered alongside other infamous blunders in history decisions where arrogance blinded leaders to reality. They remind us that symbols of pride can become symbols of defeat if they are not balanced with practicality. And in the case of France, those trousers became a stain on an army that prided itself on honor and discipline. What followed, of course, was adaptation. France eventually reformed its uniforms, its strategies, and its entire military culture. But the delay in doing so left a lasting scar. The humiliation of those first months of war never truly disappeared from the national memory. It was a constant reminder of what happens when leaders fail to recognize the world has changed. The soldiers had shown courage, but courage was not enough when wrapped in bright cloth that marked them out for death. And that is the story of how a fashion choice became a national tragedy, how uniforms meant to inspire pride instead delivered humiliation, and how one of the world's great armies learned too late that tradition can kill. History remembers the red trousers not as a symbol of bravery, but as a warning against arrogance. If you've enjoyed this breakdown of one of history's dumbest military blunders, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more stories that uncover the strange, tragic, and often absurd moments that shaped our past.